Welcome to the first episode of the Taimet Merger Review, where we take a deep dive into antitrust analysis on some of the latest mergers. I'm Gwendolyn Lindsay-Cooley, the CEO and founder of Taimet, and today I'm going to discuss my thoughts on the merger that was recently floated between United Airlines and American Airlines. I'll walk through some of the overlapping markets, including some of the 380 overlapping city pairs, discuss merger guideline implications, and the state attorney general analysis. I hope you find it useful, and thanks for joining us for this very first episode. Good morning. I'm Gwendolyn Lindsay-Cooley, the CEO and founder of Taimet, and I wanted to share my insights into a recent proposed merger with you. And that is part of the reason why I look like I'm dressed like I am going to land a plane. We're going to talk about United Airlines' proposed acquisition with American Airlines. Now, that deal has since fallen apart, but I have to say, I ran it through our company Taimet's analysis, and I thought you might find the analysis pretty interesting. So here's what it is. So this is a little bit controversial. So Taimet runs a report and does a score, and the score is not percentage likelihood of close. It is like actually a specific piece, right? So it's saying here, possible remedies, possible structural or behavioral remedies. So possible that a complaint is filed, and here it's squarely in the middle between full litigation, right? Possible trial on the merits, and essentially a divestiture of city pairs is what would be like most likely in my experience. It's an interesting time because, while in the last administration, there were so many challenges to additional consolidation in the airline industry, and it's kind of everybody's favorite industry to grumble about. There's always a joke amongst antitrust enforcers when somebody has a bad plane flight or, they get stuck trying to get to Tallahassee. The joke is, if only there was somebody who could do something about this, but alas. So we've had a lot of consolidation in the past, but that consolidation has typically been remedied with specific divestitures of city pairs. So very interesting to see that it scores what I think of as an, oh my God, I would totally, if I was an enforcer, you'd have to block this merger. It scores this as a 79. We've seen, obviously, in the past, mergers that seem to be wildly anti-competitive. I am obviously biased when I say the T-Mobile Sprint transaction, which my office challenged, and I was on the trial team for. That merger probably seemed pretty implausible in the boardroom, and yet they were able to consummate it. So, shows what I know. With that, so here's what Taimet says. Why does it give you the score? The known outcome, obviously, they abandoned the proposed merger talks, right? It's early days. It may still happen. Who knows? Obviously, there were significant market overlap. You'll see later in the report. It shows some of those specific city pairs, and of course, the structural presumption triggered times a million. So a little bit about the companies here. We always like to include the leadership team because I don't know about you, if you're an enforcer, to me, that's my number one, like, who do I need to depose? So there's quite a few issues with this. And one of the things we'll talk about is monopsony power. There is monopsony power with this as well. So both monopsony upstream and downstream effects. So transaction summary, right? United is based in Chicago. Obviously, it's a commercial airline. American, based in Fort Worth. Major competitors, right? They would be combining these two direct nationwide competitors in the market that is not what we think of as the ultra low cost carrier market, right? Because we've seen a lot of consolidation recently, or attempts at consolidation in the ultra low cost carrier market. But this is like the major carriers, right? So I think it's even more interesting. I think this is tremendously a tremendously interesting thing to have run through Taimet because I love seeing what specific things it picks as the most important. So I'm going to do the detailed analysis, which is what the score is based on. Nationwide network carrier cluster used by large corporate accounts, right? So it's talking about these, purchasers and the market power they will have over corporate purchasers who are really using United and American. I think that's a fascinating market, right? A way to get to that national market issue rather than just doing city pairs. I mean, that's one of the things I think it's publicly known, right? We all talked about in some of the airline mergers in the recent past when I was with the States, because, if you can show that it's a nationwide market in any respect, that even pleading that in the alternative, that's pretty important because then you say this merger has to be blocked completely because you can't remedy the nationwide effect with specific local divestitures. But that said, there are a ton of specific local divestitures. I note that it also said there's a number of other guidelines that would be flagged here. Guideline 3, coordination risk. Guideline 7, which is that trend toward consolidation, which we were just talking about. I think it's interesting that it flags Guideline 9 as a two-sided mileage platform. I would not have thought of that. But, I mean, if we're asking it to be comprehensive, I guess that could do that. Guideline 10, airline labor monopsony, for those folks who are interested in that. I know there's a lot of states that are interested in labor monopsony, so very interesting. One of the things that we talk about, and I've been asked a lot, and by reporters especially, like, how do you deal with mergers in the real world, right? Is this a math problem? Does Taimet just do the math problem and, sum the squares of the market shares? And the answer is no, right? It analyzes the political overlay. In this particular instance, the president has told CNBC he does not like the merger. So I think that's meaningful. I think we've seen that it's meaningful in other transactions. And then Transportation Secretary and Wisconsin native Sean Duffy also said while there's room for consolidation, they'd have to peel off some of their assets. So that is very interesting. So right? That's where you start to see why is it scoring lower than I instinctively think it should be. We've already talked a little bit about the market overlaps or the merger guidelines that are implicated. So let's talk about those market overlaps. The first one is scheduled air passenger service nationwide network carrier cluster. And how do you get to that market? And the answer is that matters because large corporations are negotiating volume discounted travel, right? Just like it says, courts and DOJ have accepted this kind of cluster market theory alongside the other kinds of city pair analysis. So I think that's really important, especially when you're in a situation, I love to talk about kind of the cabbie hairstylist level of pleading a case. You want to make sure that you are able to clearly explain to the jury or to the person on the street, like, if this is a 3-2 merger, these independent legacy networks, I think that's kind of, it's a good story for prosecutors to tell. So huge risk on that. The combined share, the estimate from Taimet is post-merger 58.7%. Obviously, that's pretty significant. You meet if we're going to just do the math here, you meet the HHI thresholds here with a delta of 1722. That's pretty substantial. That's well over even the 2010 merger guidelines threshold of 200. So you got that all day. Here's our nice twirly graph, estimated market share of United, American. Alaska has a surprisingly large piece, and Delta. And you note mainline American plus American Eagle service from 9 domestic hubs plus fortress positions, right? It's noting that there's high confidence in this, so it has a pretty good source for this. And you can see always the sources and do some further investigation here in the sources. So that's nationwide. Let's talk about city pairs. DCA, I swear every single case that I ever investigated was, what are the routes to DCA and who's on them, right? That one is extremely important because, frankly, that's how the decision makers get from hither to yon. So I think including that is an extremely important market, right? And so Taimet doesn't do the all 380 markets that it thinks are overlap city pairs. However, right, it's just doing illustrative examples, including one with DCA, super important. Reagan is crucial, and we're looking here at Chicago to Reagan, and if it's currently a duopoly and moving to a monopoly, if it's already to DCA, that's noteworthy, to say the least. If you want to get regulators' attention, if you want to get enforcers' attention, more specifically, doing something like that will definitely have some impact, especially since, if Sean Duffy's going home, just FYI, he's probably flying through Chicago. So just note that. Also, Chicago to Dallas-Fort Worth. I mean, that flight sounds like my worst nightmare. But Chicago to Dallas-Fort Worth, you've got a delta of 3,300. It's pretty substantial. So obviously you want to be thinking about what does that matter, and this is specifically pointing out a hub-to-hub route critical for corporate travel. The reason I think it's important to think about those business fares in particular is this is a different market than are they going to substitute to JetBlue, right? Because corporate travel, you need to have some really specific things. Like you need to have regular fares. You don't want to have any monkeying about with with luggage, and is the seating wild or is it fixed? Is there business class, a little bit more room to stretch out? Obviously, it's not tremendously far from ORD to Dallas-Fort Worth, but when you're trolling in the air around Dallas-Fort Worth, it's far enough. So that's an important one, and to be thinking also about how does that impact business class fares. Taimet also points out these two smaller markets, Columbia, South Carolina to Chicago O'Hare, and also Syracuse to Chicago O'Hare, right? You're looking at this duopoly to monopoly situation in these small cities. You're not going to have market entry, right? You're not going to have a Southwest or a JetBlue come to these cities because the volume just isn't there. So, when we think about the importance of having a network that actually serves all of America, I think that's something to think about. I think also interesting that it points out those two specific ones. When you start to think about state AG analysis, knowing that you're going to have impact in red states, blue states, you start to, if you're thinking about what do divestitures look like, it's hard to get to the level of divestitures that will make the 56 attorneys general happy if you start having to divest that many places. So just a thing to think about. I'll talk about, so it's pointing out cargo, right? There's 2 of 4 cargo providers. Loyalty currency sales. I think that's another interesting one that I don't typically think of when honestly, I think of, the national market for corporate travel, and I think about city pair analysis. Those are really the two that I think about. But to think about, what are the impacts of credit card issuers? I think that's an interesting point, right? That's that platform issue they were talking about. Not a ton of vertical situation. They're looking at the merger guideline analysis. Obviously, we've already talked about this a little. The increased risk of coordination is huge. The platform effects, the competing buyers, all that is super important. So I think let's look next at the state AG analysis. I think that this is actually the biggest issue for the merging parties if they decide to merge, and if they can clear the shareholder thresholds and all that stuff, and if American says, yeah, actually this is a good idea and is worth our incredible amount of time and expense that it would cost to go through all the rigmarole that they will need in order to work on a merger like that. But again, they're not asking me for business advice, but should they do so, I would say you're going to have a huge risk for state AGs because, as Taimet's pointing out here, Northeast Alliance case, JetBlue Spirit, had multi-state coalitions that were joined by, they were multi-state coalitions, and it says that they were Democratic-led. I would quibble with that a little. They were Democratic-led, but they were also, the Republican states were heavily involved. I know Florida was crucially involved. Virginia at the time was Republican, so Pennsylvania is now Republican. So it's if you've got city pair overlaps, that's something that is really cuts across party lines. It's one of those key things. So it points out these recent cases, but I'll just say one of the things about state AGs is state AG staff hang around forever because they're good jobs in livable places, as to wit, look at this wonderful background. So you really see people who have the experience. I mean, like, there are people who would still be investigating this potential transaction who are around for United Continental. So they have essentially lived with their choices. They've lived with the constituent calls about their choices that they've made, like divest this one and don't divest that, and have seen really how that has impacted. So you would have to say, as Taimet correctly says, the likelihood of a multi-state complaint is high. So obviously this deal is still early days, but I would say, man, I hope they are giving some serious thought to, at the very least, their state attorney general strategy, because, like, it's an interesting deal. So I can't wait to see what happens. And if you'd like to take a look at Taimet and check it out, we'd be delighted to give you a demo so you can run whatever merger analyses you want. And I will talk to you guys all next month. Take care.